Hi, and welcome back to Beyond the Headlines with Gordon McCardle. We're back here today with, as usual, lots going on. We've had Conor McGregor in the White House. Yay! That's something we're going to have to hit on at some point. Surely ruffled the feathers of our established political parties, and was quite entertaining to see that Micheál Martin had to beg and grovel for an invitation to a standing, let's see, a standing commitment, let's say, for Irish politicians and American politicians for many a year, many a decade, I would imagine. So, and he didn't get to go to the White House on St. Patrick's Day. It was actually Conor that got in. So, yes, I could see some ruffled feathers there and a lot of people upset. Mostly people on the left. They seem to be clutching their pearls quite dramatically as usual. And anyways, we have another thing. We had Garen Noon, who's an Irish content creator, essentially cancelled by the left again. Not that he was cancelled before by the left, but they have such a record in cancelling pretty much anybody that doesn't agree with them, which is kind of fascist in a way if you think about it. It's not at all free speech. It's not anything that the left used to stand for. And I think they've been herded like sheep into this kind of culture, much like they've been brainwashed as much as the right on a lot of political matters. And that's what we are here for. We're here to challenge that. We're here to explain that. We're here to open that up to people and to discuss it and to show the evidence of this brainwashing and of this media manipulation that gets people to, in many ways, go against their own interests, go against their own normal beliefs. We saw people shouting about Trump daring to want to end the war in Ukraine, and those were left-wing people mostly, shouting about how dare you want peace, and they're very much the people who would be out then protesting for peace. You don't see right-wing people out doing that, so you can see how media can be manipulative for a lot of people who don't read anything beyond what they see on their evening news or maybe in a tabloid newspaper or even an established newspaper like the Irish Independent or the Irish Times, which are both full of propaganda. It's mostly pro-European, pro-American propaganda. They follow and toe the line on everything. There's just, I suppose, a top-down strategy with this, and that's something we will hit on. It requires a whole other show where we go back to the 1976 church hearings in America, where the CIA was actually brought up in front of Congress and questioned. The church committee hearings it was brought in front of them and was questioned about their media manipulation and just how far they've taken it, and they actually said we can't talk about this in public. We need to go to a closed door hearing to tell you the truth on this, because it was so pervasive in 1976, and I can guarantee you our media has only been funneled down into the hands of fewer people ever since. People like Rupert Murdoch, who have their agendas, and the US government, which, let's face it, has an agenda to take over the entire world. So we're going to talk today about Ukraine. I was saying I was going to do that show. We're going to do that today. That is going to lead us into the Garen Noon thing at the end. I'm going to tip on that because it kind of ties in very well, and I just thought it would be a good day to explain the immigration thing to the Irish people, and let's hear it. Give me your hate. Give me your condemnation for daring to speak about this subject. I want to hear it all, because I refuse to speak or to be silenced rather on a subject that is so blatantly a lie and so very obvious, causing harm to the country in many ways. I'm not going to be bullied by anybody into being silenced on that, particularly the government. I actually would love to debate the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach in public on this subject. And here's what I would say. Let's get into it. So, the older people in the audience here might remember the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. If you do, you remember those days. It was about 2 week long period where the world was on the brink of nuclear war between Russia and America, because Russia was putting ballistic missiles with nuclear warhead capabilities on Cuba. And Cuba is literally 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Now, 90 miles, that's not a huge distance. A lot of people who are very fit will cycle that in a day for their races or whatnot. So with a missile or a nuclear warhead that close, you can see why that would be of concern to the Americans. So naturally, there was a global response to this. There was movies made about it. I recommend you go and watch those and see just how dangerous things were. And eventually diplomacy won out because we were so close to the brink of nuclear war. Diplomacy was what brought us back. And we are closer now today than we've ever been since that single time in history to nuclear war with the superpowers in the world right now. And that's by choice and it's by design of the US government. And it is doing that specifically because it wants to project more of its influence around the world. It wants to tell everybody what to do, and it wants to be the boss. It would love to cripple Russia. It would love to cripple China. Those are never going to happen, though. I'll explain later. But anyways, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was resolved. We understood that if we go and try and put a nuclear weapon on a superpower's doorstep, that's going to be a problem. So that's why I'm comparing and I'm talking about Ukraine today and America and Russia at nuclear loggerheads right now, so to speak. So it started basically when the USSR collapsed by treaty on December 26th, I think, in 1991. And that was the end of the Cold War. And it should have, by raison d'etre of NATO, been the end of NATO. Because that was what NATO was set up to defend against, essentially. So when the USSR broke down, you have all these nations that were in the Eastern Bloc that end up having independence from Russia or from the Soviet bloc, and it was the agreement that they wouldn't go into either sphere of influence, the American or the Russian under the Warsaw Pact agreements. And so Europe absorbed these nations in over time, handful here, a handful there. I think Slovakia and a few of them ended up in 2004. That was the time frame it took. So in 94, Bill Clinton co-signed the Budapest Agreements, or the Budapest Memorandum on Nuclear Weapons, and gave more credence to the independence of these states. And also, like I said, was the agreement that said that, okay, USA and USSR, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to try and put influence economically or militarily on these nations and so what. And then in the year 2000, Bill Clinton goes to Moscow and meets Putin in Moscow. And during that meeting, believe it or not, Putin asked to join NATO. Now, it turns out that if you go back in and you look, Russia has, from a very early point at the end of World War II, been very concerned about the security of Russia or of Europe, and has made several recommendations about treaties trying to ensure the security of Europe. And had Putin, and I know this is one thing you're going to be challenging me on, so I'm going to put let's put up the screenshot here. Now you can Google this, please do, you're going to want to challenge me, put it in the comments below, whatever. But had NATO actually taken Russia in, we would now be celebrating a world of global peace, prosperity, and community, where we would be embracing each other technologically, helping each other with natural disasters, things like the COVID, that would have been dealt with a lot better. It may not have even happened had gain of function research not been undertaken, and had we a global treaty on that, where when it was banned in the US, Fauci couldn't have actually outsourced it to Wuhan like he did. So things like that would happen, and now we have a similar situation. There are biological facilities Victoria Nuland has admitted to in Ukraine, and they're very, very concerned about those facilities and the contents of those facilities falling into Russia's hands. And you can be guaranteed that America has been financing and funding at least a part of what has been going on in those facilities. So we have those things. Now, when they refused NATO, or when NATO refused Russia entry, that was basically an end to the peace that there was. When Bush got into power, one of the first things he did was he withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia. And when you do that, you're basically saying we're taking our restrictions that we have on ourselves on nuclear ballistic missiles off the table. We don't feel like we should be restricted. It wasn't Russia that said they don't want to be restricted, they don't feel comfortable. It was America that said, we want to break this treaty, we want to remove ourselves from it, and we want the freedom to use our ballistic nuclear warheads when it suits us. And what would you imagine that would mean for world peace, or what would you imagine the Russians might think if they did that? It obviously would concern them. It's going to make them question, why are they doing this? Everything was going along so well. Now I want to start playing with my big nuclear warheads. Seems kind of strange. It wouldn't seem kind of strange, though, if your next step as the United States was to fund a coup in Georgia in 2003, overthrowing the government, installing a puppet leader, funding and arming their military. Over a period of 2003 to 2008, they basically pumped as many weapons as they could into the place, sent over their specialists, and started and armed and trained these guys for combat. And then Georgia decided it was gonna start a war with Russia. And I know you can't maybe see it on the map. It's so very small. I don't even have my glasses on. But to give you an example, it would be like the county of Cork deciding to go to war against Britain. So that would give that kind of puts things into perspective there. And I love the Cork people. I live in Cork. I mean, Aces and all that. People's Republic, love it. But wouldn't recommend the old Battle of Britain thing at all. You know, yous are great lads, very strong, fit lads and all that. Love the rebel spirit, but no. Would not go there with the old Battle of Britain is right. And you'd wonder why Georgia would do something like that. So, as you would imagine, they lost the war and then very much had to. Obama, since it was one of his proxy wars, or since it was one of America's proxy wars, Obama, whenever he got into power, then tried to reset political conditions, I suppose you'd call them, with Russia, and go, you know, things are good, you know, everything's great again. We can all be friends again. But in the meantime, like I said, there were all these other Eastern Bloc countries that were going ahead and joining NATO, which was giving concern to Russia as well, as it should, because the agreement was when the USSR ended, James Baker gave the agreement to Gorbachev that not 1 inch would NATO move past where it already was in Germany. Now, as I explained, and as you'll see on the timeline that I've posted, so, you know, I think NATO increased from 17 countries to 30, you know, in that time frame since. So it did move quite a bit east. And in 2007, we had Putin give a speech at the Munich Security Conference. Now, for him to be given a speech at a conference like this is quite an event in itself. The Western media do not, by a rule, allow him to speak. He's kind of like Jerry Adams. I don't know if you remember back in the days when the Troubles were on, they actually had a British voice actor, speak the words for Jerry. They'd show Jerry's, you know, image on the TV, but they wouldn't allow his voice. So there was a voice actor. We don't even get that with Putin. We have a full blockade on any Russian media. In fact, one of the very first things that was done whenever this war in Ukraine started was that the Russian Today website, which was their English language news website for the world, was blocked in the EU, and to access it you had to use a VPN. Now I actually have not, hand to God, been going and looking at it because I already know what the truth is. I don't need to go in there and see, and I would be accused of propaganda if people were to think that it was just a Russian agent, which I'm going to be accused of anyways, let's face it. So yeah, we have all this expansion going on, and Putin at the 2007 Security Conference gave a speech, and he warned NATO specifically about NATO expansion. I mean, that was the one thing he focused on, and you can go and you can see from one of the screenshots that we have here. So a little bit of time passes. What happens? We have, as usual, the CIA is working behind the scenes, except this time it's in Ukraine, which is right down beside Georgia on the border of Russia. And there's Ukraine right there. So here is Russia right on the border. It borders it to the point where Sebastopol is it's pretty much the only sea port that they have that's called a warm water port. That means that they can get goods in and out year round through this port. And this port in Sebastopol was actually in the Ukraine area, but because the Russian Navy have had a presence there from the 1800s, they've historically just kept that. Now we're going to talk about some other ports later. That's a whole nother show we're going to talk about. But for now, having this port was of massive importance to Russia. So when the CIA and MI6 overthrew the Ukrainian government, which was a pro-Russian government. They overthrew that government in 2014 and installed Zelensky. Now, Zelensky ran on a campaign of peace, and he wasn't going to join NATO, and he made all these promises, but he was funded and created essentially by a Ukrainian billionaire who now owns a lot of the media over there. And I can't think of his last name right now, Igor, but we'll put up a screenshot on him later also, because I know I'm going to be challenging all this. There'll be a lot of screenshots. So we have Zelensky, the comedian, being created as this politician. And if you look at America and you see this is something they do where they get anybody who's familiar to the people through TV that's anyway at all legitimate in a political sense, and then they try and put them into the big positions because the public will accept them, because the public will just take whatever the television tells them to. And sadly, most people are so conditioned these days that they will accept that, and they won't look beyond the headlines and look behind the candidate and see what's going on there. So the things that we should be concerned about. So when they had the coup in Ukraine, they installed Zelensky. It increased tensions with Russia, as you can imagine. Victoria Nuland, and you know, this is where people are going to question, oh, it's a CIA coup, and this is all conspiracy theory stuff too. I got a video here of Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State in the United States, speaking to one of her underlings, which was the U.S. Ukrainian ambassador, Pyatt, I believe his name is, Jeff Pyatt, and...
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting, and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a three-way, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got, and he's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah,
okay.
I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So
okay.
Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks.
She pretty much outlines who they're going to install in their puppet regime. And the recording is great because it not only is it a perfect audible copy, you can hear every single word very, very clearly, but to get a call like that intercepted and leaked just nails the very fact that this was a coup by the US in the one phone call. You don't need to go anywhere else. You don't need to look for anything else because it's all literally in this one phone call. And at the end of it, she says, F the EU. Europeans who think that Americans are our friend, let me explain this to you the best way I can. Henry Kissinger, one of their most important statesmen of all time, is famous for his quotes, and one of them is, to be a friend of America, to be an enemy of America is dangerous, to be a friend is fatal. And a lot of countries in this world think they're friends of America, and I got to tell you something. From years of studying politics, America doesn't have friends. Even right now, people might say, Israel, America's going to drop Israel in a heartbeat once the budget gets too critical for them. And that might not be too far away. We should watch and hope for that and pray for that, actually. It'll bring peace to the Middle East whenever the US does finally run out of money. And they're at $36 trillion, $100,000 a second just in interest payments, and they can't keep it up. And that's, we're going to do a show about this actually separately because it's an hour or so on its own. So we'll talk about that. So when we had Victoria Newland, she was going around the square in Maidan handing out cookies to people. We had John McCain over there. everybody's, all the American politicians screaming for Ukrainians' right to defend itself and join NATO, essentially, knowing that this was going to be a provocation for Russia and just essentially pushing the envelope to see just how far they could. Now, when they did that, like I said, the phone call clearly states it. But what they also did was they started to arm and fund the Azov Brigade. Now, the Azov Brigade is something you should look up if you haven't seen. And believe you me, if you go onto some Russian websites, social media or whatnot, you will see content about the Azov Brigade, which you might say seems propaganda, but it can't all be propaganda. And they themselves, much like the Israelis, are very proud of their actions and tend to share them on social media. So we have that to review as well if you doubted some of their actions. They, like a Nazi battalion would, went out and brutally murdered, raped and pillaged and did everything that was a war crime that could be done to civilians, particularly Russian speaking and ethnic Russian civilians in the Donbass and the Crimea region. And that's what happened after the 2014 US coup in Ukraine. The war started then, and it was being fought almost in a guerrilla style tactic at a very, very, say, low temperature, so that it hummed along with very small operations, low levels of troops, very little heavy artillery or anything like that being used. And at the same time, the Azov brigades were going in and doing the things they were doing, which is why the Russian Congress held a vote, and this was after Crimea had a referendum, which had an 83% turnout, and 90% of the people who turned out voted in order to join Russia. Now, they had a previous referendum, and I think this is going back to the 90s again. I'm going to have to check on that now, but they did have a referendum before where, again, very large numbers of people voted, overwhelming majority, voted to rejoin Russia, because that area, like I said before in a video, it was like Northern Ireland. You had like Protestants coming over to Ireland and settling and living, and considered themselves Northern Irish or Irish and British, and while they considered themselves British also, they didn't want to go back to Britain. And it's essentially the same thing with the ethnic Russians in that Crimea region and the Donbass region, Donetsk and everything. So the Azov Brigade went in and checkpoints, names, papers, killed, stole land, did whatever. Like I said before, did exactly what settlers or colonialists or whatnot would do if they want to ethnically cleanse a region. And we see as what we have going on in Israel and Gaza today, mistreating the people. And that's why the Russian Congress took a vote and said to Putin, we're putting this in front of you now, we're telling you to go into these regions and protect our Russian people who are living in that area, who are ethnic Russian speakers. They banned, Ukraine banned Russian as a language. They couldn't teach their kids Russian. They couldn't use Russian in their schools anymore. They couldn't speak it in public or whatnot. these are people who for thousands of years have been brother and sister, the Ukrainians and the Russians, and now all of a sudden they're putting these divisions between people where they weren't there before, and very much so the Irish British problem was made a religious problem, because the people in power are very crafty, and they know that if they use a religion as the basis of these fights, then it's easier to get people riled up on one side or another. But anyways, we had the Azovs go in, we had them doing that. What we also had going on, and this was only revealed in February 26th of 2024, the CIA from day one, whenever they overthrew the government, went in with the Ukrainians and set up 12 CIA stations in Ukraine, listening posts they call them, dotted all along the border of Ukraine and Russia. Now, the next step, obviously, with the NATO expansion was to defend Ukraine, which was to bring in the missiles. Now, this is where we come back to the very beginning, where we have to ask, how is it that if Russia puts missiles on America's border, it's okay to go to, nuclear war, but Russia's not allowed to defend itself and not allowed to in any way protect itself or stand up and say, no, you're not allowed to do that on my border either. I don't think any of, my friends out there would think themselves so special that they get to be an asshole, but everybody else must be nice. And I don't understand how America gets to put military bases, and very many of them. Let's take a look here. I've got a graphic on that now. So, and if you look at the graphic here, you're going to see, just like on the map, the only places on the world where there aren't military bases, essentially, are Russia, China, India doesn't have one, it seems, Australia. Now, Australia doesn't need them because Australia is essentially an entire military base itself of the USA. They're very much an ally, always will be. But if you think about it and you look at it, and the projections of these military bases in their localized areas, you will see that there's about 860, 870, maybe even 1,000, if we consider their presence in other nations, military bases dotted all over the world. And very many of them are dotted right along the Russian border and the Chinese borders. And so you would wonder, who's afraid of who? And why? If America has 850 or 900 military bases around the world, and most of them are dotted along the Russian and Chinese borders and whatnot, well, who's really attacking who, and who's putting who under pressure here? Let's step back and look at it from a neutral point of view. And I'm Irish, I'm very much capable of doing that. Americans, if you're watching, I'm sure some of you are. I hope some of you are. Please God, some of you are, because you need to hear this. You're not special. Okay? You're not special. You do not get to rule the world and tell everybody what to do. Okay? So, hope you got that one. Anyways. So, with the, invasion in 2022, that invasion was after years and years of the Azov Brigade, the CIA stations going in, lots of different provocations, sanctions, different things.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
Britain tried numerous times to avoid a war and to avoid escalations. And I would argue that indeed Putin has been very, very restrained in his actions. And that if he wanted, he could have taken Ukraine in its entirety months ago. He hasn't used jets. He hasn't, used very many large missiles. Don't know if you are aware, but it's all been tanks and small artillery. There's not a whole lot of big stuff going on, and there's a reason for that. Because America knows that if they started a serious war over there, that Russia would destroy Ukraine in about an hour. It's all it would take. That is not what the US wants. The US, and the reason it started this war, was to drain and to weaken Russia, not the USSR anymore, to weaken and drain Russia, because America knows it's on the downward spiral right now. And in order to sort of stay relevant, I suppose, or stay in any way in power, they need to bring Russia and China down to their level. It's not about America rising up. They can't. They don't have the technology, they don't have the money, they don't have any way to rise up. So they're tearing people down. And they did this in 2008. I'm going to do a whole other show on that, because that was an economic action. Right now, the action in Ukraine, like I said, it is to weaken Russia. And you may not believe me, but I was in a room with Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, I think it was Donald Regan. And Donald Regan was the speaker at a group of the top 50 investors in one of the largest, I'm not going to name them, one of the largest investment firms in America. And I happened to be in the room with these people, the people who owned Harley Davidson, the people who own, most of the shares in Coca-Cola. Very, very, very rich people. And Donald was up, he was giving his speech after dinner, and he told the crowd how America bankrupted Russia during the Cold War. And he was like, and every one of you in here made money from it. And I was standing there thinking of the Russian people, the 70-year-old granny with her headscarf on and her woolen coat, standing in the bread line, hoping and praying that that day she could get a loaf of bread. And seeing the tables laid out with the most expensive wines, the best food, top chefs in America and top wines and everything there. And the amount of opulence and money that was in that room. And they were cheering the old granny on the bread line. And they thought it was brilliant how Donald had said, yeah, the whole 1980s and everything Reagan did, it was all about breaking Russia and destroying their nation. And the pride that these people took in that and joy was something to behold. And so if you think that that's not an agenda today, I can tell you exactly that America does things like that. And I firmly would argue that the financial crisis in 2008 was entirely manufactured, that the US deliberately sold AAA mortgages that they knew were bad in bulk. They targeted Deutsche Bank in Germany, and they sold them into the Bank of England. They sold them all over the world, and they did it deliberately. They inflated the price of property globally because it was when the American market goes up, the whole world market goes up. So Irish property prices went through the roof with it, and it was all a bubble that they were trying to create because, again, the Americans know that economically they've overextended themselves with the dollar. They're, like I said, 36 trillion in debt, and in order to protect themselves or to, again, keep themselves relevant or in power, they damage everybody else around them. They attack. And so they deliberately sold those bad loans into Europe so that Europe would take on these, debts essentially of America. It meant that the US taxpayer wasn't liable for those debts once they sold them overseas. You had Europeans now buying these bad American mortgages. So that's what happened. They sold them all over into Europe, and they packaged them up and made them all look nice and pretty. And of course, we all invested, and we all got fleeced. And yeah, and that was an act of economic warfare against the euro, because the euro was becoming a reserve currency and was stronger than the dollar, and the dollar decided, well, those Europeans, they're nice people, but time for a smack. So the Irish people got landed with 42% of the European debt for that one. So when you think of America next time, remember that one. So, yeah. Now, the next thing that we had was Trump withdrew in 2019, from another treaty, the INF treaty with Russia, and that was another cause of contention. So at this point, he hadn't invaded Ukraine, but the low temperature war was still ongoing from May 2014. And, in order to maybe stoke the fires, I guess people did that. When the invasion did happen, we had the Istanbul Peace Accords. I believe that was in April. I think it was February when he started the invasion. By April, they were in Istanbul having peace accords, which would have ended the war. But again, that's not what America wanted. Going back to what I was saying earlier, America didn't want the war over quickly because it wouldn't weaken Russia. If Russia had or if Ukraine had accepted the peace deal in the Accords, the Istanbul Accords, that would have ended the war, but that wouldn't weaken Russia. And like I said, if the war had been escalated to a point where he was using fighter jets and ballistic missiles, he would have destroyed Ukraine in an hour. That wasn't what America wanted either, because that wouldn't weaken Russia. For the 400 or 500 weapons or missiles that he could have used to destroy Ukraine in an hour, they'd build those back up in a month or two. There's no problem. So what America wanted, and what now the Europeans are looking for, now that America's backed out, is the Europeans want to continue this war, at least at this temperature, not getting too hot, because we don't want to get up to a point where Russia actually does something and kicks our butts, but we want to keep it going at enough where we're hurting them economically, except that we're not hurting them economically. Russia's economy has actually grown. They have found ways around all of the sanctions, and then there's BRICS. So really, what has happened here is the CIA America and Britain, with the full backing of the EU, started a war with Russia, trying to take Ukraine into the EU and into NATO at the same time, being warned that this was going to start a massive war and Russia wasn't going to take it. And they gambled and they lost. And now Trump doesn't like losing. That's one thing about Trump. Trump's smart enough to know that if Russia wanted Ukraine, he could have it like that. He's not interested in a low-level war over there because it doesn't help America. How does Ukraine have anything to do with America to begin with? Is it on the US border? No. Really, does America love its allies that much? No, we've seen that. He's inflicted tariffs on most of his allies as it is. And he's planning on invading the rest. So, like I said, the friends thing, that doesn't cut it. So, I'm going to put up a screenshot here of Boris Johnson going to Kiev because people won't believe that either. He flew to Kiev on the instructions of Biden to shut down the peace talks because, like I said, it wouldn't have weakened Russia enough. They didn't accomplish what they set out to accomplish, which is to harm Russia and to have them essentially spend so much money on a Cold War like they did in the 80s that their people are back on breadlines again. That's what America wants for Russia. Now, the problem is, if you actually go to YouTube right now and type in any major city in America and do a walkabout, you'll see people who do these sort of just walkabout videos. You will see that America is pretty much a failed state right now. The empire is collapsing from within. The infrastructure is outdated, is collapsing in a lot of cases. But the cities, the streets are lined with tents, junkies. It's a failed state. It really is. I mean, I know we have our issues here in Europe and we have homeless and all that. But if you go to, say, I know one video in particular I watched that because I used to live in Northern California, and it's called Unboxing Northern California. And if you went and watched that, or go down to Skid Row in LA, type those into YouTube and look and see the reality of America today. When you're not in your gated community, there's either a gated community or there's tent city. The gap between rich and poor is widening to such a degree that there's very little in between anymore. The middle class is disappearing, and our leaders are planning a massive heist of the middle class here. They're planning on stealing billions and billions of our tax money in Europe, all across the whole bloc, to rearm Europe against a threat that doesn't exist. Russia is too big as it is. Putin has no intention of taking over Europe and trying to control Europe and Russia. It is insanity to think anything like that, let me tell you. Okay? Any of the academics, any of the professors in geopolitics, political science, international relations will tell you exactly the same thing. Pure nutcase insanity. Von der Leyen, okay? And I wouldn't stop at that. I'd continue with that description and yeah. Every EU government that tells you we are facing a Russian threat is lying, okay? Yes, Trump has pulled the plug on the Ukraine funding. He does not want to have to fund all of NATO, and he's going, oh, y'all need it. if we don't have a threat, we don't need to rearm. Okay? China, when was the last time China invaded somebody? What, 40 years since they were involved in any sort of conflict. And in that same time with America, how many different conflicts have you got? You have too many to count, let's just say. Go back to Wiki and look at that. Anyways, the point is, there is no Russian threat. There is no threat from China. Go and look at the cities, Chinese mega cities. Type that into YouTube. Take a look at what life is like over there. After you've watched Unboxing California or Northern California, go then and look at the Chinese cities and see the difference. When you look at an American car and then you look at a Chinese car today, the electric cars that they're putting the tariffs on because they want to dissuade Europeans and Americans from buying them, is because the technology is so cheap and it's so much better. China is 30 years ahead of the rest of the world. We should be making peace with China. They want to make peace with us. They're building the Silk Roads, the Silk Road and Belt. I got a whole, we're going to do a whole show on that actually. We're going to do a show on why Trump is so invested in taking over Greenland. Because that's just come out of left field, I bet, for a lot of people. So there's a whole show there separately on that we're going to do, because I think I've talked quite a bit for today. So thank you all for listening. I hope this has been informative. I'm welcome to hear your criticisms and critiques. Put it all in the comments. Yeah, I'm getting an email address, and I was going to maybe invite... yes, coming back, I was going to invite Garen Noon on and see if he wanted to have a chat. If he's watching this, contact me through the network here. I'm sure there's a way through YouTube to message me. I'd love to have you on. I'd love to hear more about what you were saying. I watched your video, didn't find anything wrong in it, and I believe that if the Irish people were to go ahead and look through the timeline that I have just given them here and all these screenshots with these headlines to back it up, they would come to the realization that they have been lied to 100% about the Russian threat, that the Russian invasion was entirely provoked by the EU, by the CIA, by MI6, and this is exactly what they wanted. And that there is absolutely not one need for one Ukrainian refugee, they call them. I call them tourists, because they go back and forth on their holidays at Christmas and for summer, and they come back and they're like saying how great it was at home and they're having a great time. The Ukrainians did not build houses for us when we had the troubles going on in Northern Ireland. Okay? Nobody in Ukraine was building a €500,000 house for any of us on the border, at least. Okay? I was on the border. I was actually almost blown up a couple of times, I can tell you that. And nobody built me a €500,000 house in Ukraine. Okay? And on top of that, you have people in Carkby that weren't being one bit affected by the troubles when they were on in Northern Ireland. And you have the exact same going on in Ukraine. There's a very small pocket of Ukraine where that war is going on. As far as the rest of the country, it was exactly like Northern Ireland. And there's a lot of room there for all of those people, and there's not one need for them to have ever been in Ireland. And the reason that I bring this up is because 120,000 of those people came over here and got housed, got given benefits, and are getting weekly payments that is way too much. You want to see the amount of money that's being shipped out of this country. There's a lad that comes into this town once a week in a transit van, and he's loading it up, sending the stuff back to Ukraine. You want to see? But besides that now, The very fact is, Ukraine begged along with the CIA to start this war. That's the fact of this. The elites in Ukraine did. They got what they asked for, and now they're crying about it. It is not our responsibility to pay for Ukrainian or American wars. Okay? It has absolutely nothing to do with Ireland. There is not one reason that we should be taking in 120,000 people and housing them, while the homeless numbers of this country went up for the Irish people. 15,000 of them homeless. But yet we could find 120,000 people homes without a question. Now, besides that, you walk around the towns and you just see a lot of them falling around the place with bottles of vodka or falling out of cars. We saw one video where a lad was following a car down the road, and he was across both sides of the road, and the young lad thankfully stopped the car, and your man fell out of it practically. A man in his 50s just abandoned the car and stumbled off. Was obviously at least one bottle of vodka in. That wasn't, just a small bit of drunkenness. This was like locked off his tree. So when we see people crying out from the left about, we need to save Ukraine, you need to cop on, okay? You need to wise up and see that you're being robbed. And not only are you being robbed, but hundreds of millions of euros of taxpayers' money is now going to be funneled up to the rich people who own the weapons companies, because the economy has run out of steam. The Americans were so kind whenever they blew up the Nordstream pipeline that they only charge the Europeans 5 times the amount the Russians were charging for gas. Those are American friends. They're 5 times the price for gas. Look it up. And that's why the factories in Germany are closing. Volkswagen build really great cars. I gotta commend them on that. But the problem is that they build such great cars, they last forever. And so loads of people now have great cars, and there's really just not a huge market. But now they're actually turning their factories into weapons factories, because that's the next money maker. And the people who we've never elected, the people who run the EU, they're not elected people. They're selected people. And they're people who are selected because they're going to do what they're told. And what they're told to do is not in our best interests. And Ireland and a lot of countries should either leave the EU or start a campaign and repeal the Lisbon Treaty, because we were told we voted wrong. That's how democratic the EU is. You voted the wrong way. We're going to have this referendum again, and you'll do it the right way the next time, won't you? Yeah. Once we did the Lisbon Treaty, that allowed the EU to run rampant now. And the people that are in power are psychopaths. And the general rule is that if you're somebody who seeks power, you're not fit to be in power. There's a better way of putting it, but that's the general gist of it. Anyways, like I said, I'm going to leave it here today. There's a lot I've unpacked, a lot I've probably given you to research there. Give me your comments, give me your likes, give me your dislikes. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.